Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here today. Great to see so many people here to join us as we present results from the Northern Ireland Life and Times on attitudes to climate change in Northern Ireland. I want to begin by talking a little bit about the context, all the way from the planetary right down to the personal, by way of the Northern Ireland context, the legislative context, and the context of adapting to climate change and dealing with climate change in Northern Ireland. But first I want to start by asking a question. And the question is this: what is the most productive economy on planet Earth? What is the most productive economy on planet Earth? You might think that it's one of the big ones, like the United States of America or the People's Republic of China. You might think it's something smaller, dynamic, and closer to home, like Switzerland, the Netherlands, maybe one of the Nordic nations. Or you might think it's some far-flung entrepot like Singapore or the United Arab Emirates. The most productive economy on planet Earth is none of these places, and yet in a way it is also all of them, because the most productive economy on planet Earth is planet Earth. Is planet Earth. The cycling of energies that constitutes life on Earth underpins all our economies, all our societies, all our ecologies. And the climate sustains it all. Every nation, every person, every species. Climate change threatens to disrupt that delicate equilibrium of life on Earth. And so as we adapt to climate change, as we mitigate climate change, and as we transition our economies and societies so that they work with the grain of the climate instead of against it, the fulcrum on which all of that change happens and pivots is society. And that means that our attitudes to climate change, including here in Northern Ireland, will shape how we address it. I want to talk a bit now about the Northern Irish context, or the context in Northern Ireland. And I was introducing some first-year social policy and social work students to the environment as an issue for them to consider this year. And instead of just reeling off facts and figures, I wanted to help them visualise Northern Ireland in 2050 under three scenarios of warming: 1.5, 3 and 4.5 degrees. So I asked an AI to create an image of worst case and best case under all of those scenarios. And I'm going to show you them now. It just helps us visualise. I'm something of a visual learner, helps me visualise it, help my students. Hopefully it can help you as well and help us consider the context in which Katy will be coming soon to talk about attitudes at this moment in time. So this is Northern Ireland in 2050 under 1.5 degrees warming. This is best case on the left and worst case on the right. This is Northern Ireland in 2050 under 3 degrees of warming. Best case on the left and worst case on the right. And finally, this is Northern Ireland in 2050 under 4.5 degrees of warming. Best case on the left and worst case on the right. Just for the record, I'd just like to point out I had nothing to do with this bear turning up here in Main Street of Belfast in 2050. Absolutely nothing. I'm not taking responsibility. The AI made me do it, just so that's clear. So if that's the Northern Irish context, what about the legislative context? Well, in 2022 we had the Climate Change Act passed, and many different and important parts of that: carbon budgeting, mandatory reporting, and some delays to its implementation, partly for political reasons, which again Katy will be speaking to, and the data that we've collected speak to some of the challenges and delays as well as the opportunities. And a big part of the implementation of this is obviously going to hinge on it being done fairly and via something called a just transition, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The UN defines it as a transition to net zero emissions that is orderly, is inclusive, and is just. And this is something that's very much in the news because we had the consultation on the establishment of the Just Transition Commission to oversee and implement and advise on a lot of this. And some of the results, the summary of the results from that was actually out just last week. I want now to talk very briefly about the political aspects of this, because in seeking to achieve a net zero Northern Ireland, using and working with us as people, the society of Northern Ireland. There are tensions and trade-offs within society about this that we need to understand, and our data speaks to that, and also reconcile. And when I was speaking to my students earlier in the academic year, I spoke to them about reconciling the tensions and trade-offs between societal priorities. It would be wonderful if there was always a triple win-win between economic development, ecological transition, and a welfare state, that we can always have social democracy, a just transition, and green growth. But the fact is that often there are tensions and there are trade-offs between these priorities, something that we as a society need to navigate. And the politics of this place need to navigate as well. So I polled my students, and I just asked them, I'm going to be polling all of us shortly, but I polled them and asked them which did they think was most important. So this was first year social policy, social work students. Many of them are probably going to spend most of their life working for the welfare state. It might have been very different if this was Management 101. We might have had more growth of GDP. Or if it was Sustainability 101, we might have much more focus on a just transition. But the point is that there are tensions and trade-offs between our societal priorities when it comes to addressing climate change in Northern Ireland. So understanding the different attitudes, what Katy's going to be speaking on shortly, is really important. There are also tensions and trade-offs between the societal groups, all the different stakeholder groups and interest groups that make up our society and make up our economy as well. And the Just Transition Commission has 7 statutory groups that are mandated to be represented on it. And so I polled my students again, and I asked them which of these did they think the Just Transition Commission should give priority to. And the results might surprise you, because this is what they said. Again, this is just a small, random, convenient sample of a class. Farmers, number 1, perhaps recognising the closeness of the Northern Irish society to the land compared to, say, other industrialised nations. Young people, number 2, environmental groups. If you're an academic or a fisher person, sorry, you're at the bottom of the pile in this. But again, just like with priority, there are tensions and trade-offs between societal priorities, there are tensions and trade-offs between societal groups. And that's why understanding our attitudes, what Katy will be talking about next, is really important to help us understand how we best address climate change in Northern Ireland and how we do it in a way that is fair and just and brings as many with us as possible. We're going to do, I need you to get your smartphones out now, because we're going to do a little bit of audience participation. Mentimeter has let me down spectacularly, as it did on Friday, so I'm going to come out of this and we're just going to have to access it. I'm going to ask you a question, and you can access it via the QR code. It may be working already, it may not. Or you can go to menti.com and use the code at the top of the screen. And I'm going to come out so that we can hopefully see the results in real time once it gets over itself. My question is this: in terms of our personal, now we're talking about the personal context, your interest and your thoughts on this, how likely is it that net zero targets will be reached? We're talking about Northern Ireland. Been some polling on this at the end of last year by Cavendish Consulting. What do you think? How likely is it that net zero targets will be reached? Just as those are still coming through, and if you haven't had a chance, we're going to move on very quickly, so now's your opportunity. The figure in the report for Northern Ireland at the end of last year was 11%, and that was 11% that thought it was likely. So this is where we come to the title of today's topic, that climate of trust. It's really important that we have trust in institutions and the information and each other and our political representatives and our universities and all of these stakeholders. Trust that we can together deliver a net zero Northern Ireland. So very, very similar figures. There's a lot of work to be done. A lot of work to be done. I think we'll be discussing that and some of the challenges Katy will be speaking to just after me. So if that's the personal context, attitudes are influenced by each other, but they're held at the personal level, which was why at NILT we poll individuals. And this is a trailer for what Katy is going to be talking about. This is just a short video summary of the key findings that Katy will be expanding on shortly. But in terms of the personal context of people in Northern Ireland thinking about climate change, here's some key findings from our work. So this is the second opportunity for you to get out your smartphone. And what I'd like you to do now, that video and the report are meant to be shared. It's on our social media platforms, all of which are here. So what I'd really like you to do is this is firstly, if you don't follow us on any of these platforms, please do on the one that you use most often. Please go to your social media platform of choice. And at the top of the ARK page for that platform, you will find the video and the link to the report. And if you would, and you're comfortable doing so, please share and share widely so that this conversation doesn't stay in this room but goes far beyond it. I'm just going to... And if you have done that and you're twiddling your thumbs, you can sign up to our monthly newsletter via this QR code here, which will bring you every month the latest updates on our work, our events, our publications, including attitudes within our Young Life and Times and Kids Life and Times to environmental themes coming out later this year, which is very exciting as well. Thank you for doing that. As I said, meant to be shared, not meant to stay in this room, and great to have lots of people involved in the conversation. So I'm starting to come towards the end of what I want to talk about. Just a few more thoughts on the personal context. Got another interactive slide for you. We talk a lot, when we talk about the individual, we talk about climate change, we often go straight to all of the challenges, and my goodness, they are considerable. We sometimes then jump to the solutions, and those are really important. And there are a lot of opportunities as well as challenges involved in that. But this has to be part of a bigger vision that we hold as individuals for the future of Northern Ireland, for the future of the UK, for the future of this continent, for the future of this planet. And so I want to ask you, because it's important to have vision front and centre when we think about the future and climate change, the good, the bad and the ugly in Northern Ireland, what your vision for, I'm just going to have to come out of Mentimeter again. What is your vision for society and climate change? This will create a word cloud. You can put 3 words in or 3 very short phrases. What is your vision? You see, we're obsessed with data. At ARK, we just can't pass up an opportunity to collect data from pretty much everybody all of the time. But we're genuinely interested. We ask because we care. What is your vision for society and climate change in Northern Ireland? Please let us know, and we'll see. Should see the results in real time. Okay, we might have to skip this one. Mentimeter is great, but it can be a bit moody. Okay, we'll try one more time, and then time means that we need to move on. It's coming up? No. Okay, apologies about that. The importance, and maybe this will come up in the discussion, we can talk about that then, the importance of vision, of articulating what that vision, and also of reconciling the pluralities of visions that we're going to have between those tensions in societal priorities and those tensions between societal groups. Again, Katy's going to be speaking to some of those different groups within society and their attitudes to climate change and to addressing it in Northern Ireland. So just to finish up, we have looked at the context of attitudes to climate change in Northern Ireland, starting with the planetary, all the way to the personal via the Northern Ireland, the legislative and the political. And a reminder that the fulcrum in which all of this change happens, the adaptation to climate change, the mitigation of climate change, that transition, ideally a just transition to a society and economy that works with the grain of the climate. That the fulcrum on which all of that change pivots is us, it's society. And that means that understanding attitudes and our attitudes to climate change in Northern Ireland will shape how we address it. Katy is going to come now and unpack in some detail the data from NILT and what that looks like.
Thanks very much, Jonny. Morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially a pleasure to see such interest in this really important topic. So I have had the pleasure of working closely with Paula over the last several years on the political attitudes module in the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey. And there are several questions that we want to repeat every year in order to do our time series analysis. But we also have the opportunity to ask some new sets of questions. And speaking with Jonny, whose particular interest obviously in the environment, and speaking with my husband, who's an accidental environmental activist, and realising that we haven't covered this topic since 2000. It was long overdue that we began to see what public attitudes in Northern Ireland are towards climate change. And as you might get from our title here, it really relates to that question of, as political sociologists, this wider sense of trust in those who've been elected or have responsibility to lead in trying to address those targets that have been set by the Climate Change Act, and also responding to what we see from this data is widely recognised as being of urgent concern. So in this data, we were trying not only to look at what's going on in Northern Ireland in this new context, but also be able to compare ourselves with other places. So at a few times we were able to use the same questions as are used in the European Social Survey, which is across Europe, including the UK still. And we were able to see where Northern Ireland stands, which is really, really good to be able to do. So the first question, straight up, as Jonny says, no one is going to try to be mobilised or respond positively to difficult decisions being made politically if they don't think that climate change is a concern or that it's caused by human activity. So we see from this, most people in Northern Ireland think, 6 out of 10 people, think it is caused primarily by, climate change is caused primarily by human activity. And we have another 27% who say yes, human activity is significantly responsible for this. Being able to put this in context of wider European attitudes, we can see that Northern Ireland isn't doing so well. In fact, if we compare it to elsewhere in Europe, only Lithuania and Slovakia have higher degrees of skepticism regarding climate change than we do here. And if we look at older European social surveys as well, we can see this pattern is quite consistent. In fact, Israel and Russia are the only ones 10 years ago who had attitudes as low as ours. So this is a cause of concern. And part of it, in some ways, I think relates to the question of trust, which we'll touch on a wee bit more. Just as an aside, one thing that has been interesting to see through the European Social Survey over time is there's the waning belief that human activity is responsible for climate change in the UK and Ireland, so that figure of 88% is lower than it was in previous ESS surveys. So this is something that we need to be keeping an eye on, because it's different perhaps than what we might expect. Then when we come to specific, the set of questions that we're able to ask on this, trust in scientific experts is pretty low. So 2/3 of people do think that scientific experts can be trusted to tell the truth on climate change. However, nevertheless, we see 8 out of 10 people think it poses a serious threat to the future of human civilization. Similar proportion want to see international cooperation between states to address climate change. So recognizing this goes beyond national capacity itself. It's not something that we can manage on the basis of an exercise of sovereign will. This requires international cooperation. 3/4 of people want to see politicians elected from their constituency do more to tackle climate change. We struggled in the phrasing of this question because we wanted to include MLAs as well as MPs, so hence it's phrased that way, but we think most people understood what we were getting at. And then that question of personal responsibility, which Jonny came to at the end. So 3/4 of people say they have a sense of personal responsibility, trying to play their part. Now, obviously if we're talking about a context of trust and a sense of responsibility and a belief that something needs to happen in order to address this overall threat. There's other dynamics of interest going on there in terms of political and social dynamics. And when we look at various other factors in different groups in society, we begin to get a sense of what's happening here. I make no apologies for this, but you won't be surprised that I thought Brexit might be significant in all of this, and sure enough, one of the most significant differences in terms of attitudes towards climate change comes down to attitudes towards Brexit and European Union membership. So if we look at those who voted leave in the 2016 referendum, so long ago, and those who voted remain, this is a very significant line of difference. So you can see much more scepticism amongst leave voters than remain voters. Also, there's a higher degree of them thinking that it's maybe caused equally, but generally speaking, there's much more doubt. So only 4 out of 10 leave voters thinking it's caused primarily by human activity. That difference between those two groups in society continues on into the other questions as well. And these are the most significant gaps we've found in terms of groups in society as a distinct variable in terms of likelihood of having certain attitudes towards climate change. So 30 percentage points difference, notably in relation to whether scientific experts can be trusted on this matter. Perhaps we wouldn't be too surprised to see that, but also 30 percentage points difference in relation to whether climate change is a serious threat, whether there should be more international cooperation to tackle it. Again, perhaps that's not too surprising. Very significant, almost 40 percentage points difference on whether they want to see politicians do more to tackle it, and similarly that sense of not being that worried about it personally. So very interesting finding there. Not unrelated is unionist, nationalist and other affiliations, political affiliations in Northern Ireland. We see unionists much more likely to think that climate change is not happening, or if it is, it's happening due to natural causes. There's an interesting degree of similarity between nationalist voters and those who describe themselves as nationalists and those who describe themselves as neither unionist nor nationalist. And then we decided to look, therefore, at political party support as well. And this relates in part to some of the other work I've been doing in relation to attitudes towards the Windsor framework, and recognising, obviously, there's high degrees of differences amongst unionists, for example. So wanting to dig a bit more deeply into that. And sure enough, as you got the hint of in the video, there is a very distinct difference between DUP supporters and those from other parties, including the UUP. And the reason it's worth mentioning this, of course, is because of the nature of our executive and the importance of having DUP support for activity that happens or decisions that are made by the executive with respect to important policy moves, including on climate change. So greater scepticism about scientific experts, much more doubt as to whether climate change really poses a serious threat, scepticism about international cooperation, and also only 1 out of 2 DUP supporters wanting to see politicians do more to tackle climate change. So again, this is important because if the supporters of a very major party in our executive are not really wanting to see their politicians act on this issue, then they're much less likely to be motivated to do so. On other lines of difference, to dig down a little bit more into that, we can see, again, there's 24% of DUP supporters actively disagree that they want to see their elected politicians do something on climate change. So that is a notable finding too. Okay, let's look at other groups in society. So in terms of those wanting to see, that same question about whether people want to see their elected politicians do more to tackle climate change, as we mentioned, 3/4 of people overall. That includes 77% of women compared to 71% of men. Interestingly, older people are more likely to want to see their politicians do more to tackle climate change. And there isn't a significant difference at all between rural and urban dwellers. That's something that surprised us. I think we didn't necessarily expect to see that. Then in relation to whether climate change poses a serious threat, obviously if you don't think it poses a serious threat, you're much less likely to want to see action to respond to it. And notable differences on this, you do see a difference, the gender difference is notable here, but also too rural and urban differences here too, and I think it'd be interesting to hear what Kate has to say on this in the discussion later, that sense that being less convinced about it posing a serious threat. The sense of personal responsibility, connecting to that point Jonny was making earlier about the connection of the big picture to the personal. Again, women more likely to think that they have a personal responsibility to tackle climate change, therefore likely to make decisions in that regard. Also, we see a very significant difference between younger people and older people on this. Again, possibly not what we expected to see, that older people are more likely to want to see politicians act, more likely to have that sense of personal responsibility. Not big difference rural-urban on this one. On scientific experts, there is a significant degree of wariness towards scientific experts. You can see here, this looks more or less the same, but if you look at in terms of those who act, like men, much more likely to disagree or strongly disagree that scientific experts can be trusted. And we also see, this is notable amongst rural dwellers, and there's a bit more scepticism too amongst older people. So that's a lot of data, presented as prettily as possible, as I could manage anyway. But just to summarise where we are then. So Northern Ireland is one of the most climate sceptical regions in Europe, which is very striking. Yet still, a clear majority of people do believe that climate change is primarily caused by human activity, and they do see it as a serious threat to the future of human civilization, which is quite a big threat. Notable how much more sceptical Leave voters are compared to Remain voters about the issue. Also significant is the fact that DUP supporters have quite, generally speaking, different attitudes to those of other parties, including the Ulster Unionist Party. Men seem to be personally less worried, have less keen to see political action, less likely to feel a sense of personal responsibility than women are regarding climate change. In terms of the rural-urban difference, possibly not as significant as we might have expected on some questions, but there is a wariness of scientific expertise, perhaps, a bit more caution around that, and being less convinced it poses a serious threat. And then amongst younger people, we see they are more trusting scientific experts than older people, but less likely to have that sense of personal responsibility or enthusiasm for seeing political action to address these issues. So I will leave it there. Thanks very much.